If you remember, we're in a series which is, it's got a theme about reality as a tantric guru. So what does that mean? Hopefully by now you know, but I'm just going to remind you in case it's not coming straight to your mind. Well, in the Tibetan tradition, if you're lucky, you find yourself what's called a tantric guru. That's if you're practicing tantric Buddhism. And this is someone who you think has seen through the delusions of the human psyche for themselves. So at least you think they've done that. And what you do is you ask them to help you to see through delusion as well. So some tantric gurus are quite scary and they're quite crazy as well. And they might ask you to do all sorts of crazy, bewildering kind of things that you don't understand, perhaps dangerous things. And and through that, they hope to point you in the way so that you find, you understand, you see through delusion for yourself, you find reality for yourself. But in this particular Buddhist tradition, we don't go in for tantric gurus. I mean, we might be quite crazy and weird, but we don't kind of encourage people to take on having a guru. And that's partly, I think, because, we're Westerners, and there's been lots of stories where Westerners haven't really understood what's been going on with the tantric guru, and there's been some kind of quite scandalous things that have happened as a result. Some people have got hurt by that. So it's not something that we go in for. But actually, in my experiences, we don't need to have a tantric guru, because reality itself will do it for us. If we pay attention to what's really going on in our lives, if we really engage with it, we can find that that in itself is enough to act like a tantric guru would. It allows us to see through the delusions. And in this series, you'll remember probably that a couple of weeks ago, Bodhinaga talked about about death, and about how the experience of bereavement and perhaps the experience of facing our own deaths, contemplating our own deaths, can actually be a real understanding of what is most important to us. And last week, Surimati talked about the call of reality. So she talked about the call of what is beautiful, what's meaningful, and how we might hear the call and how we might respond to it. And this week I'm looking at truth and reality. So what I'm really looking at actually is the stories we tell to ourselves, to others, and about the world, and how those stories might relate or not relate to reality. And a little bit about what that reality might or might not be. So let's start with truth. So if you remember back to the newcomers course, where we talk, about week 2 or 3 or something, about ethics, and we talk about telling the truth. And you remember that when we do the exercise where we ask people to think up the different characteristics of somebody who they admire. I don't know if you remember that, you write it down on lots of different bits of paper and it gets piled up at the back, and then there's a vote. And miraculously, there's always 5 different principles that come out. And one of those principles is the principle of integrity, of honesty. People see that as something that's really key to contributing towards living a healthy life, a happy life, a rewarding life. And actually it seems fairly straightforward at first, I mean, most people know that telling huge whopping lies is going to kind of get us in a bit of trouble. But when we explore truth a little bit more, we find that it's more subtle. It's perhaps a bit more difficult than that. Because we look at, for instance, how a lot of the time we're acting like our own PR campaign. We're kind of running this campaign, this subtle campaign, where we're trying to portray ourselves how we think it would be good to be, how others might think it's cool for us to be. So we want to look good, we want to be interesting, so we exaggerate our stories just a little bit. And people often find that they take on practicing the precept of truthfulness for a day, and it's much harder than they thought it was going to be, actually. It's one of the hardest to put into action. And then in the newcomers, we also explore how we actually can create a reality of how we talk about the world. So our actual experience has got many different aspects to it. And what we concentrate on and what we talk about to ourselves, what we talk about to others, that will create how we see the world. So if we concentrate on the things that we don't have, we concentrate on the way that the world and people has treated us badly, well, we'll live in a world which feels of lack, a world of poverty, of envy. But if we concentrate on what we do have, on the things that have gone well for us and what people have given to us, well, then we live in a world of abundance, plenty. And we look at how we create this world. And then, actually, during the beginner's course, we also look at how the Buddha says that actually, when we're looking at truth, some of the kind of key ways that we act, the ways that we think about the world, might not be true after all, actually. Because we tend to think that we're a fixed, discrete self. And the way to happiness is to look after number one, to look after ourselves, to make sure we get what we want and that we do what we like and we don't do what we don't like. And that's the way that we'll end up getting happy. And the Buddha said, well, maybe that's not true after all, actually. So I suppose you could say there are at least 3 levels to truth, or 3 ways in which we could talk about truth and reality. So there's what you might call a sort of mundane level. So that's what happens when we don't say, we don't tell the truth, I suppose, when we don't say what we know to be true, actually. The second level you could call a psychological or even karmic level, which is what we see as what we say about the truth, what we see as the truth, creates our own reality. So that's karmic in the way that you remember we talk on the newcomers about karma is actually creating our reality tomorrow about the way we behave today. So if we see the world in a certain way today, we behave according to certain truths today, we'll be creating a truth tomorrow. And then I think there's a third level at which we can see truth, which is, perhaps you'd call it the absolute truth. And that's where I suppose reality and truth are the same thing. And you can call that dharmic reality. So if you've heard of the niyamas, this could be the realm of the Dharma niyama, but if you haven't heard of the niyamas, it doesn't matter, okay? I'm just throwing that in for people who have. It doesn't matter at all for the talk. And you will hear about them one day. So I'm talking about there are these 3 levels of truth. And I'm going to explore those in this talk. So, let's start with a story, with a cautionary tale. So what can happen to us when we try to mess with what I've called the mundane truth? And this is actually a true story. It's a good question. So what is a true story? But anyway, I'm telling you, this kind of happened in a kind of way. I'm telling you my version of it. So this is the story of a lone sailor. And it's set in the late 60s, starts in 1968. And there was a guy called Donald Crowhurst, and he lived in Somerset. In his mid-30s, he was married and he had 4 children. And he ran a small company which made electronic components for self-steering yachts. So basically he made stuff for yachts. But his business was not doing well at all, okay? It was heading for the rocks. So he was very worried about bankruptcy, and it was about loss of social status, the loss of social status for him and for his family. Because he was from an upper middle class family, and he believed that he needed to live a certain way. For instance, he needed to pay for his children to have a good private education. So life was getting pretty stressful for him. He wasn't making that kind of a money. What he did have as a kind of a refuge or as a way to escape from the stress is he went sailing. He went sailing at weekends, whenever he could. And in the late 60s, there was quite a lot of interest in long-distance solo sailing. So one person in a little boat taking huge journeys across the oceans. The year before, in 1967, Francis Chichester had sailed right round the world on his own, but he'd stopped off in certain places. And so, because there'd been a huge amount of interest in his story, the next challenge was to sail right round the world non-stop. And the Sunday Times decided to set up a race, and it was going to give a prize which was worth £5,000 at the time, which apparently is worth £75,000 now. So it was a reasonable price, £75,000 for the first person who could sail around the world. And the rules said you could start this race whenever you liked, as long as it was before the end of October, and the award would be for the first boat that went round, and the big money prize would be for the quickest boat. Okay, so the aim was you could start when you like, if you wanted to get around as quickly as you could. And so loads of kind of really experienced adventurers and explorer types lined up to take part in the race, 9 of them in total, and Donald Crowhurst decided he was going to go for it too. Okay, so I've done a little bit of sailing myself, a little bit of yachting, and I know how small those boats are. They look, I don't know, they're tiny actually, and Yeah, it's pretty amazing to think of sailing in such a little boat across these huge seas. And in those days, of course, technology was very different from how it is nowadays. There wasn't a satellite. You couldn't just ring people up and have a chat with them as you were sailing and kind of check things out. You didn't have the amazing electronics that people have now that tell them where they are, give them weather forecasts, all that kind of stuff. You really were on your own. And you'd probably be at sea for 9 months. You wouldn't have much sleep because you'd have to keep getting up to check where the boat was. Very little communication with the world apart from a radio, perhaps. And Donald Crowhurst thought he'd take this on. I mean, he really wasn't much more than a kind of good weekend sailor, so it was a big thing he decided he was going to do. Some of the wildest oceans in the world he was going to go to, the Southern Ocean, where the waves are just huge. I mean, just really huge. And in fact, out of the 9 people who set off, only one of them actually managed to finish the race. So you can see what a challenge it was that he took on. And in fact, his bid to win the race always looked a bit dodgy, because he'd kind of got convinced that he'd have a new boat design and with his own technological innovations, and that he could win. And he got financial support from a local businessman to build this boat, which had 3 hulls. But the money came with a bit of a proviso. If he didn't finish the race, he'd have to pay for the boat himself. Okay? So if he didn't finish, he'd have to pay for the boat, give the money back. And actually, to make things perhaps more complicated for him, he fell into the hands of a press officer who started selling the story of him as a plucky English amateur with incredible prospects of winning the race. You know, this idea of this kind of English amateur against the odds, he was going to do it, he was going to win. So the deadline was coming nearer and nearer for the race, and all these stories being told in the press about him, but he was struggling to make his boat seaworthy. And in fact, the day before his voyage began, he was making his last-minute preparations. He actually went back to the hotel with his wife and burst into tears. He broke down because he knew that actually his boat wasn't ready and he wasn't ready for it. But he felt like it was too late to pull out because the PR man would be really furious and he'd have to pay the money back and the family would be ruined. So he set off, and actually, it didn't start well. He had to go back to the harbour in the first few minutes of the journey, and when some technology broke down. So he kind of set off, made slow progress. All the other sailors were nearing New Zealand, but he was still right up in the North Atlantic. But at least he was still afloat, actually, because 5 boats had dropped out in those months. So a lot of boats dropped out. But he started to feel really anxious about his boat because he knew that actually it wasn't seaworthy, and that when he went into the big oceans, he was going to sink, probably. But he knew if he went home, he'd face what he saw as ruin, financial ruin, and kind of ruin of his pride as well. So he's stuck. Did he carry on, maybe sink, go home, see himself as a failure? Well, what he did actually is he did neither. What he did is he dropped out of the sailing lanes and kind of went to the one side and started to radio home a whole load of quite amazing positions. So when you're sailing, you do a log. So you write down every few hours how far you've sailed and where you are. And he started to radio those home, and they were looking great. But by day, I suppose he was doing that, and at night he kept his real log as well. So he was sending out this kind of false story. So he was starting to tell this story, and everyone thought he was doing really well. And after a while, he thought, well, what am I going to do now? So he was bobbing around in the Atlantic off Brazil, just there, and he thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that my radio has broken down, the generator's broken, and I can't fix it, so I can't be in radio contact with anybody for a few months. So that's what he did. During that time, he actually had to go into port to get some repairs and stuff done, and that was breaking the law, breaking the rules of the race anyway, but he did it. Anyway, he still kept up his this idea that he was racing, and he decided to get back in radio contact after some months. So this would be when he'd actually gone round the world and come back up to the Atlantic, if you see what I mean. So he spent a load of time, a few months, in one place, knowing that everyone else was kind of going right round the world, right down the bottom, and then up again. So that's when he renewed radio contact. And it looked actually like there was a possibility he could win the race, which was the worst possible thing that could happen. So Robin Knox Johnson had actually arrived home in England, back to a big hero's welcome, but he'd gone very slow. And it looked like there were two other people still in the race. One of them was Crowhurst, and he could possibly, be the fastest, according to the things that he'd radioed home, this kind of log that he'd radioed home. The trouble is that if he did come in with the fastest time, his logbook would be given really scrupulous checks. He'd get loads of press coverage, and the fact that he'd called in at that Argentinian port to do his boat up, probably someone would put the two things together, and he'd probably been shown to be a fraud. So he didn't know what to do. So what he thought he'd do is he did this kind of faked journey home, again, more faked, where he just went very slowly, where he'd probably come in second, so he wouldn't have to give the money back for the boat or anything like that. He'd come home, but he wouldn't get the prize. However, because the other person who was still in the race got really worried by the fact that Crowhurst was behind him, as he thought, this guy started sailing very fast and taking loads of risks, and so he had to be taken out of the race when his boat, I think the mast went on his boat, and he had to be taken out of the sea. So that meant that Crowhurst was looking like he really was going to win the thing. And, what was going to happen? He'd, come home to a hero's welcome. There'd be a flotilla of boats to see him into the harbour, whisked to London for a celebratory dinner, TV interviews, the whole lot, okay? So it looks like he was really affected profoundly by this. So he drifted deep into a personal depression, stopped sailing, did write his logbook, and he seemed to sink into some kind of a madness where he had lots of delusions of grandeur, a kind of bringing together of God and Einstein in some kind of way. And he made his last entry into his logbook in the summer of 1969, after he'd been at sea for 243 days, so most of those days as well without any radio contact with anybody. And 12 days later, his boat was found drifting, so he wasn't on board the boat. So we don't know if he took his own life or if he fell off his boat, but anyway, he wasn't on the boat. But what was found on the boat were two sets of logbooks. So there's one log, which was his actual journey, and then there was another log, which was the false one that he'd presented to the world. So, back in Britain, Robin Knox-Johnson was actually given the £5,000 prize, and he must have been quite a guy, because he gave it to the Crowhurst family. He didn't keep the prize for himself. But for Donald Crowhurst and for his family, his 4 children, it had been a tragedy. And in a way, it's like a Greek tragedy, isn't it? Because you can see how he created it for himself, telling this false log that just led him into worse and worse problems. And although I suppose not all of us would set off on such an adventure going around the sea, I kind of feel like it's a situation any of us could get ourselves into. And it's like you start by telling one little lie, and then it gets worse, and then you're telling more little lies. And in the end, you've got this whole big story going, and there's just no way out without losing a lot of pride. Yeah, so I think that's why it's such a shocking story, really, because we can so clearly see the consequences of what starts out of a small deception. And I think it really resonates with me, because I suppose, like many of us, it's like, throughout my life I have told lots of small deceptions, and I've been lucky that they haven't really got me in huge messes, but, at some point they might have if I'd been in a different situation. So, false logs. Donald Crowhurst literally writes a false log. And, as I said, we might think of ways that we ourselves have written false logs and published them to the world. And perhaps in a way we're all writing false logs all the time. We're editing what we show to the world, what we say, how we present ourselves. And it's interesting, actually, he did keep a true log, because I'm not sure that I always do keep a true log. At least he did that. But another way I suppose we can look at the idea of a false log is through stories, through storytelling. And right now there are 2 books I just want to mention to you that I found really helpful. So, sorry, don't think there's more. So the first is the story of Donald Crowhurst, actually, is in Tales of Freedom by Vasantra. And there's lots of other stories in there as well, which are really great to read. There are books about Donald Crowhurst, actually, and there was a really good film a few years ago as well. But I think the way that Vasantra presents it, he particularly talks about it in terms of the precept about telling the truth. So that's a really good book to look at. And then the other book I'm finding really interesting at the moment is by David Loy. And David Loy is a Buddhist, an American Buddhist academic, and the book is called The World is Made of Stories. And I would really love it if someone else would read it, please, because I'm the only person I know who's read it, and I really want to talk about it with somebody. So if you read it, tell me. So stories. The world is made of stories. So we're all storytellers, aren't we? All the time we're telling stories. It's a very human thing to do. It's how we make sense of this bewildering, this confusing world that we live in. We've given so much information all the time that we have to tell stories. We have to find a structure, a framework, perhaps a meaning to our lives. Even actually our perceptual understanding of the world is a story. So our senses have a huge amount of information coming into them all the time, which they can't process. So what they do is they kind of make up stories for us about how the world is. Apparently, particularly with sight, our brain is telling us stories all the time about what we see, because it can't quite, because we see this huge right round, if you look right round the room, you're taking quite a lot. And what your brain is doing is it's kind of using what it knows from the last time you looked to tell you a story about it. There are really complicated experiments that people do to show that, but that's basically what's going on. And, you might have had an experience which maybe kind of demonstrates how your brain works to you, is that you're walking. So I was walking along once, and sort of trees up ahead, and I saw a white shape in the tree, and I saw it as an owl. I thought, wow, an owl in the middle of the day. And then as I got closer, I saw it as a kite, a children's kite. I thought, oh, a kite stuck in a tree. And when I got right underneath it, I saw it was a plastic bag. And it's not that I kind of thought maybe it looks like an owl. I saw an owl. Do you see what I mean? And you've probably had that experience where your eye tells you something is something, it turns out it's not true. So it's a bit like even our senses. We're living in a world where stories are being made up for ourselves. And this is true, I think, you can really, if you compare our sense systems with those of other animals. So I was saying to John, it's really good that Laura Dog is here today, because I want to talk about dogs. So her experience of being in this room will be very different from ours. I think her experience is probably, I don't know, but I presume it's as rich as ours, but in a very different way, because she's smelling lots of things, okay? So she's got this weird to us, normal to her, world where there are all these smells coming and going. Some are interesting and some are not, some have noticed and some she doesn't. And I kind of imagine if it might be like for us, so there's lots of different colours or something like that, and they've got different meaning to, I don't know. But anyway, her experience of this world is quite different from us at the moment. Hopefully what I'm saying is making some meaning to you, but to her it will just, there are some words I could say, which I won't say, don't worry, John, but, where she might leap into action. But, mostly her experience is different from ours. And yet we sort of live in the same world, don't we? Which is quite interesting. We have these different experiences from our senses, but we are living in the same world together. Anyway, so I suppose the difference between human beings as well and dogs is that presumably, I don't know actually, anyway, presumably they don't tell as many stories as we do. We are telling stories of our reality all the time. So, we tell stories about ourselves, we tell stories about other people, we tell stories about the world we live in, and we tell stories about the nature of reality itself. So I just want to explore some of that storytelling, some of those stories. So stories about ourselves. So what stories do you tell yourself about yourself? So is your story that you're shy? Or maybe your story is that you're outgoing? Maybe your story is that you had a good life, or maybe your story is that you've had a difficult life. Maybe your story is that you're a very amazing person whose talents and abilities just haven't been recognised by the world yet. Or maybe your story is that you're like a really bad person who ought to hide yourself away. Or actually, I seem to be able to tell both those stories at the same time. It's amazing how complex, actually, and contradictory our stories can be. And those stories are having an effect on us, and they're having an effect on other people. Because often, actually, our stories are quite unconscious, so we don't even know we're telling them to ourselves. And I think an important part of our spiritual development is where we find out the stories that we live from. And we check out with ourselves and with others whether that story actually still has any connection with reality. I mean, maybe once it did, maybe once it didn't, I don't know, but does it now? And is it helpful? Is the stories that you're living from, are they helpful to you? I mean, at some level, Donald Crowhurst, was telling himself a story that actually did have the capability to sail around the world, and that was not a story that was helpful to him. So, I think, as well as finding out the stories about ourselves, what kind of people we are, we'll also be telling ourselves stories about what will make us happy and what we need, what we couldn't possibly live without, what's right, what's wrong, what's acceptable, what's just not acceptable. And again, these are stories, and we need to work out whether they're helpful to ourselves and whether they're helpful to other people. And one way to do that is to tell our stories to other people, actually. And perhaps sometimes in particular to tell other people those things which we feel are so huge, so bad, that we can't tell anyone else about them, things we carry as a burden. Those things that seem to fester away inside us for years. Because my experience is that when I can tell those things to a friend, and it has to be someone I trust, I'm not suggesting you tell them to everybody, somebody you trust, it's amazing how great it feels to let go of that burden, not to be carrying it around anymore, to put that story down and to live without it anymore. We just feel much lighter. So stories about ourselves, one type of story. Another type of story we tell, obviously, is stories about others. And, people behave in all sorts of ways, and what often seems to me, but very weird and wonderful ways. I'm really constantly surprised and bewildered by the way that people behave. And so I'm always making up theories, basically. I'm kind of writing a detective story quite often, where I kind of look for clues, because I'm trying to understand why people are doing what they're doing. And then when I've come up with my theory, where I've kind of, finished the detective story, then I think, right, I know it now. And then I sometimes pass it on to other people as well, actually. And also I'll listen to their stories they've got as well about somebody, trying to build up this idea of why people do what they do. And actually, it's helpful in a way, isn't it? But I do want to help them actually come up with the truth, really. Because, I've just said that my stories about myself are very contradictory, very conflicting. So people are contradictory, they're confusing. We're made of lots of different strands. And we have to be careful, because when we get a certain story about a person, we treat them according to that, they will create a reality that they might well start to behave like. So for instance, if we think that people are dishonest, they might start to behave dishonestly. An example I've got is quite a few friends of mine work in the NHS, and about, 5 or 6 years ago, some hospitals started really cracking down on people having one day off holiday, as if kind of people were having that day off because they were presumably hungover or skiving or something. And that meant that if you have one day off, you have to kind of go through all sorts of bureaucratic things, whereas if you have 2 or 3 days off, you're fine. Okay. So what do people do? Because they've been treated like they're dishonest. People, if they need to have one day off, they know actually what they're better to do is have 2 or 3 days off, So that's what people do. So actually by treating people as if they were pretty dishonest and trying to kind of rip the NHS off, those people started to behave like that a little bit, actually. And I think people who work for big organisations, you will have that experience of being treated a bit like you don't really want to do your work, things like that. And what does it make you do? You kind of feel a bit like you don't really want to do your work, actually. That's the way you're being treated. So we can create a reality with our ideas about other people. So, of course, we need to try and understand other people, and we need to try and understand their tendencies. But basically, we need to just be very careful when we generalise. And we can be particularly and spectacularly wrong, I think, when we speculate about other people's motivations. Okay? I think that's something to be really careful about, and probably best to ask them. If you really want to know why someone does it, then you could ask them. And I suppose the last thing is, with people, if we've got a certain idea of how they are, we might kind of limit them, we might trap them in that idea. And particularly if people are in a spiritual community, what they're trying to do is they're trying to change. And sometimes people do change very dramatically and very rapidly. But other people will still react to them like they're the old person. So an example I use is someone called Maitri Siddhi, who some of you will know, who lives at Taraloka. She was Ginny in Sheffield a few years ago. She was in a study group. And she went away to Taraloka, and I'd only ever see her every 5 or 6 months. And she was really changing, because she was really leading a very intense style of life and really changing. And every time I realised I had to speak slightly differently to her. It was like a slightly different person that I was meeting. And I think that's true of all of us. We're all changing all the time. But we can get an idea in our heads that person A is a certain way. And if we do that, well, we will fix them. You know, that experience when you go back to your parents' house and they still see you a certain way, and it's somehow really hard to get out of it psychologically and kind of be an adult sometimes. You know, it's just, we can get fixed in other people's perceptions. Now, actually, that whole series, that whole little bit I've talked about other people, I do feel like I'm kind of telling myself quite a lot of those things, because I love talking about other people and speculating about their psychological issue, whatever made them like that and stuff. So a lot of those things, it's kind of more like do what I say and don't necessarily do what I do. Okay, so the next one is stories about the world. So we've got loads of stories about this world we live in. So maybe sometimes the world is a scary place. Or maybe it's an amazing place just waiting to be explored. Or maybe we really need to look out for ourselves because nobody else is going to look after us. Or maybe we need to put our family first. Our family will look after us. Or maybe the world will look after us, actually, and we can kind of live in this world and it will look after us. Maybe you need 20 grand a year to be happy. Maybe you need 50 grand a year to be happy. Maybe you need 100 grand a year to be happy. Or maybe you think talking about money is just distasteful. You shouldn't be thinking about things like that. Maybe it's a world that rewards all these good, hard-working people with happy, prosperous lives. Or maybe it's a world in which the rich are trying to rob the poor all the time. So many stories that we have about the world that we live in. So I think a lot to explore there, really. I mean, my opinion, my story, is that one very sure way to have a distorted view of the way the world works, or what the world is about, is to believe that the news on TV, on the internet, in newspapers, is giving a full and reliable picture of the world. Because, news is chosen for particular reasons. So it's usually the worst things that are going on in the world, the most awful things that people are doing to each other. And at the same time, there are loads of really great things that are going on in the world that aren't being talked about in the news. So I think there's something about, when we watch the news, if we don't want to get really depressed, it's really important to be thinking about it's only one part of the story that's being told to us. Yeah. So we create a reality, of course, by how we see the world, or those ways that I saw the world. If you see the world like that, well, you'll be creating a world in which that is the true world. And there are some very deep ideas we have, actually, about how the world should be. They're so part of my conditioning, the ideas I've got, that it's really hard for me to see them, actually. It's a bit like, a fish doesn't see the water, doesn't see the water. It's a bit like that. And one of them got really challenged a few years ago when an Iranian person I was talking to, I was talking about freedom of speech, and he said, freedom of speech to say what? And he just really, in the way that he said it, he really challenged all sorts of ideas I have about, well, freedom of speech is, of course, good. Now, I've gone away and I've thought about it some more, and I think on the whole it probably is quite a good thing. But what I realised then is I'd completely taken it for granted that freedom of speech is something that we ought to have, and I'd never really thought about it. It's part of the world I've grown up in. Freedom of speech is good, democracy is good, all sorts of things. And maybe they are good, I don't know. But there's something about looking at those views and working out for ourselves whether we, ourselves now, think that those are things that we believe in or not. And interestingly, when I was first challenged around the freedom of speech thing, it's almost like my identity as somebody who believed in freedom of speech was challenged. And I found it quite difficult because I had a self-identity that was being challenged. But once I started to explore my views, sometimes it's really exhilarating because you can just let go of all this stuff that you've just been carrying about how you see the world and you don't even know it. You can let go of it and there's a kind of freedom in it. Okay. So, lots of ideas, lots of stories about how we see the world that will be affecting how we live. And then there's stories about reality itself. So what is reality? Okay, well, I'm not going to tell you. Because, maybe one of our false log entries, one of our ideas, is that we can really understand reality one day using concepts and ideas. and that we can use words to say how things really are. So I think it's very interesting, well, something I love about Buddhism actually is how we're asked to really think about that, and to think about some of the things in a way that we hold most dear as Buddhists, to challenge those. So if you've ever done a sevenfold puja, you've probably heard the Heart Sutra recited. And the Heart Sutra is from a collection of some ancient Buddhist texts, the Perfection of Wisdom texts. And in the Heart Sutra, we recite it during pujas, so you'll have heard people recite it if you haven't done it yourself. And basically what the Heart Sutra is, the bit that we recite, it's like a story about somebody who is attaining enlightenment, seeing things as they really are. And in the Heart Sutra, what he says is that his experiences, there are a whole load of things that, that don't exist as we think they do. Okay, they're all inherent. They're all empty of existence. So what we say is, so it's the long list of things that there isn't in enlightenment. Okay, and we say, nor is there pain or cause of pain, or cease in pain, or noble path to lead from pain. Not even wisdom to attain. Attainment too is emptiness. So you might recognise that the first part, nor is there pain or cause of pain or cease in pain or noble path to lead from pain, that's actually the Four Noble Truths. And probably about 6 weeks ago, I stood here and I gave a talk about the Four Noble Truths and how really, really important they are, and how they're like one of the first things that the Buddha taught, and they're really key Buddhist teachings. And they are. However, this bodhisattva, this figure who's intent on gaining enlightenment, he's saying they don't really exist. And then he even goes on to say, there's not even wisdom to attain. Attainment too is emptiness. Well, I really love that. So it's kind of going, so all this stuff that you're working so hard to do to become really wise, it in itself is also empty of inherent existence. So it's a bit like the key teachings that we work with are shown to be inherent of existence themselves. It's not saying that these teachings don't matter, that they're not important, but I think what it's saying that in a way they're stories too. Okay? They're very helpful stories, but they're stories too. And that the real experience of life is much more than we can write down, than we can say, than the Buddha could say actually, and then that got passed down to us. There's much more to life than that. It's much more mysterious. And it's really important that we don't start taking teachings too literally, because that's what we like to do as human beings. We like to kind of go, yes, that's real, that's a true story, and everyone needs to follow that and do what I say, kind of thing. That's what we like to do. And actually, the Bodhisattva here is saying, no, question that, question the stories. Reality is different from your stories about it. Whatever reality is, it's going to be much bigger and quite different from your stories. Yeah, so maybe you could say one of the stories that we hold, one of our sort of ultimate stories, is that we have distinct selves, that we have selves that are separate from the rest of existence, and that we need to look after those selves at all costs. And maybe that's a story we might start to see through a little bit or loosen around. So, is enlightenment not having any stories? I don't know. Maybe enlightenment is still having stories, but seeing through them and knowing that they're stories. But I think until then, until we know for ourselves that, perhaps what we need to do is we need to work on having helpful stories. We need to see what our stories are and try and create stories that are nearer to what seems to be real, whatever that is, but also that are I suppose, more effective, more helpful to us and to other people. Okay, and if you're kind of thinking, if everything's just a story that's a bit nihilist, kind of what's the point in it all? Well, kind of, I think nihilism is just the idea that everything is going to end, in a way that everything's going to end, so what's the point in it all? If you're kind of thinking that about it, well, I think nihilism is just another story that you could explore and think about. Okay. So, well, that's good, because the story I've been telling is that I need to tell do my talks in 40 minutes or under, and I've just had the note for 40 minutes, so I'm nearly there as well, actually. So, that's good. Okay, so I've been talking about truth and reality, and I've been talking about 3 levels of truth. What I call the mundane level, which is basically reporting on the facts as they are. And it's really important that we do that we do keep a true log, because else we can find ourselves alone, drifting in the North Atlantic, cut off from the people we love, not in touch with what's important to us. Then you could say that there's a psychological or perhaps karmic level, where what we think is true will actually create our reality in the future. We are creating our own stories. And that's where I think we really need to be mindful, so that we know what our stories are, and we need to be metaphor, so that we're choosing helpful, loving stories. And then there's the last bit, which I think you could call the dharmic or the transcendental level of truth, in which we realise that much of what we thought was true and real is not. We realise that we're telling stories all the time. And in fact, the very concepts that we use to talk about reality get in the way of knowing the truth. It's going to slip away from our conceptual minds. I'm not saying that we won't know truth in some way, we won't know reality in some way, but we're not going to do it conceptually. Because truth is much bigger than we are, and we can't hold on to it. In fact, the truth is that we're part of something much bigger than us. The truth is that we're part of a reality that we're just part of. That lie, you could call that reality life with a capital L. It's much bigger than us. And it in itself, I suppose, is the ultimate tantric guru in the way that I was talking about. We're going to have stories, but when our stories are different from life with a capital L, that we're always going to lose in the end. So I'm going to end by reading a short poem, which was written by Sangha Night, who's the founder of the Triratna Buddhist movement. And I think it's because it gives to me a hint of where we fit in, I suppose, where our truths fit into reality. So the poem is Life is King. Hour after hour, day after day, we try to grasp the ungraspable, pinpoint the unpredictable. Flowers wither when touched. Ice suddenly cracks beneath our feet. Vainly we try to track bird flight through the sky. Trace dumb fish through deep water. Try to anticipate the earned smile, the soft reward, even try to grasp our own lives. But life slips through our fingers like snow. Life cannot belong to us. We belong to life. Life is king.